Are you sure that you are truly free today? We're used to comfort and supposed democracy, but what if medieval England, with its rigid hierarchy and preordained destiny, isn't really that different from our world? Are you ready to look back and see how the absolute power of a minority shaped the lives of millions, depriving them of the right to choose, to freedom, and even to hope? Get ready to plunge into a world where your fate was sealed from birth, and every breath, every piece of bread, every marriage depended on your place in the ruthless social ladder. Medieval society was rigidly structured, with a hierarchy of power that defined every aspect of life. In this video, we take a look at the roles and responsibilities of each class, from the king at the top to the peasantry at the bottom, giving you a deep insight into the complex social structure of the Middle Ages. Watch this video to the end to find out why, even in the face of such injustice, people found the strength to fight, hope, and even great things. At the very top of the medieval English pyramid of power was the king. His power was considered to have been granted by God, which gave his rule a sacred character and made it practically infallible in the eyes of the majority of the population. The king was not just a ruler, he was the supreme landowner, theoretically owning all the land in the kingdom. All the other classes, from powerful barons to impoverished peasants, were his subjects and owed him loyalty and service. His word was law, his decisions final, and his will absolute. The king was the commander-in-chief of the army, personally leading the troops in battle, which required not only strategic intelligence, but also personal bravery. He was the supreme judge, deciding the most difficult disputes and passing sentences that could cost lives. The kingdom's financial system was also under his complete control. He collected taxes, minted coins, and managed the treasury. However, despite the apparent limitlessness in lusty, even the king faced limitations. His rule depended on the loyalty of the barons, who owned vast lands and had their own armies. The discontent of the nobility could lead to uprisings, civil wars, and even the overthrow of the monarch. In addition, the church had enormous influence, and its support or condemnation could significantly strengthen or weaken the position of the king. The royal court was the center of political and cultural life, a place of intrigue, luxury, and making fateful decisions. The most powerful people in the kingdom gathered here: advisors, courtiers, foreign ambassadors. The king's life was full of ceremonies and ritual, designed to emphasize his greatness and divine origin. He constantly moved between his many castles and manors, demonstrating his power and collecting tribute. But how easy was it for a king to rule such a vast and disparate state, where each baron aspired to his own independence, and the peasants lived in a constant struggle for survival? Was his power so absolute that he could ignore the interests and ambitions of his powerful subjects? And how did he maintain the delicate balance between them? If you want to know the answer to this question, watch this video to the end. To maintain his power and control over the rebellious nobility, the king used a variety of tools, balancing between direct coercion and cunning. One of the key mechanisms was the feudal oath of allegiance. Each baron who received land from the king brought him homage, a public oath of allegiance, which imposed on him the obligations of military service and advice. Breaking this oath was considered a serious crime and could lead to the confiscation of land and titles. The king also actively applied the policy of marriage unions, marrying his daughters or other relatives to the sons of powerful barons, thus creating family ties that were supposed to ensure loyalty. It was a kind of investment in the future stability of the kingdom. In addition, the monarch had the power to appoint and remove key officials, such as sheriffs, royal representatives in the field, justiciaries, judges, and treasurers. By appointing loyal people to these posts, the king was able to effectively control the provinces, collect taxes, and stop the abuse of power by the barons. Royal justice was also a powerful tool. Although the barons had their own courts, the king could accept appeals and intervene in cases, thereby demonstrating his supreme power and limiting the arbitrariness of the feudal lords. Strengthening the royal courts and creating the common law were important steps towards centralizing power and reducing the independence of local lords. The king also actively used financial leverage. Barons were required to pay various feudal dues and taxes to the king, for example, when inheriting land, when marrying daughters or sons, as well as during crusades or wars. Evading these payments or refusing military service could result in fines, confiscation of land, or even imprisonment. Periodically, the king conducted an itinerary, which allowed him to personally inspect his possessions, communicate with his subjects, and demonstrate his omnipresence. These trips were not only a way of collecting tribute, but also a powerful symbolic act of affirming his dominance. If the baron refused to comply, it could have disastrous consequences. First of all, the king could declare him a rebel, which meant the loss of all his lands, titles, and rights. The baron's castles were besieged, his lands ravaged, and he could be executed for treason. For example, King John the Landless actively used such tactics to suppress the resistance of the nobility. In such cases, lords who owed allegiance to a rebellious baron were faced with a painful choice: support their immediate overlord and become an enemy of the king, or go over to the king's side, breaking their oath. This led to civil wars that could last for years, ravaging the country and causing suffering to the entire population, including innocent peasants. However, even in such a struggle, the king tried to maintain the support of the church, since excommunication from the church of a rebellious baron could significantly weaken his position and deprive him of support from the religious population. Thus, maintaining the delicate balance between coercion and compromise was a constant task for any medieval king. Immediately below the king was the highest nobility, powerful barons, counts, and dukes. These people were not just rich landowners. They were feudal lords who were granted vast territories, fiefs, by the king in exchange for military service and an oath of allegiance. Each baron owned dozens or even hundreds of villages, castles, forests, and fields where thousands of peasants lived and worked. Their power over their lands was almost absolute, and they had the right to collect taxes, administer justice, and even maintain their own small armies. The role of the high nobility was twofold. On the one hand, they were a pillar of royal authority, providing the king with troops in case of war, participating in the royal council, and performing local administrative functions. Without their support, the king could not effectively govern the country. On the other hand, they were a potential threat to the throne. Ambition, civil strife, and a desire for greater independence often led to conflicts between barons, and sometimes to revolts against the king himself. The history of medieval England is full of examples of such rebellions that could plunge the country into the chaos of civil war. The life of a baron was full of privileges and responsibilities. They lived in fortified castles, symbols of their power and protection, and maintained a large court of knights, servants, artisans, and priests. Their days were spent managing estates, participating in hunting, touring, and of course in military campaigns. Their education was focused on military affairs, chivalrous ideals, and land administration. They were the main customers of works of art, architecture, and literature, supporting the development of culture. However, despite their wealth and power, their lives were far from serene. Constant wars, political intrigues, and the threat of losing land or even life were part of their daily routine. How did the king control these powerful feudal lords to prevent them from becoming completely independent rulers? And what tools did he use to maintain their loyalty when their own interests often conflicted with those of the crown? And what happened if the baron refused to obey the king? And what consequences did this have for him and his lands? If you want to know the answer to this question, watch this video to the end. The king, in order to control powerful feudal lords and prevent them from becoming completely independent rulers, used a complex system of interdependence and checks. The main instrument was the feudal contract, which was the basis of their relationship. The lands were granted not as absolute property, but as fief feud, which was kept from the king on the condition of military service. If a baron failed to fulfill his obligations, for example, he did not provide the required number of knights for the army, the king could confiscate his fief or impose heavy fines. This was a powerful threat, as land was the foundation of power and wealth. The king also actively interfered in the internal affairs of the barons, using royal justice. Although the barons had their own baronial courts, the king gradually expanded the jurisdiction of the royal courts, offering fairer and more efficient justice. This allowed peasants and smallholders to appeal to the king if they felt wronged by the lord. Such appeals not only undermined the barons' authority in their lands, but also reinforced the king's image as the supreme arbiter of justice. In addition, the king could appoint his own administrators, such as sheriffs, to oversee the activities of the barons and collect royal revenues in their territories. Sheriffs, as representatives of the royal authority, could report any signs of insubordination or abuse. The next step in the feudal hierarchy was the knights. They formed the backbone of the medieval army and were professional warriors trained in weapons, horse riding, and combat tactics. Knights received land, knightly fief, from barons or the king himself in exchange for military service. Their primary duty was to protect their lands, their lord, and the kingdom as a whole. They were symbols of honor, valor, and loyalty, even though the reality of their lives often differed from romantic ideals. Knights lived in relatively modest castles or fortified manors, managing their small estates and the peasants who worked on their land. Their lives were devoted to military affairs, training, participating in tournaments, and most importantly, in wars. They were heavily armed and equipped, but their armor and weapons were very expensive, which required a significant financial investment. Knighthood was not only a military rank, but also a code of conduct that prescribed nobility, protection of the weak, loyalty to the Lord and the Church. However, not all knights were rich and powerful. Many were the younger sons of noble families who could not inherit their father's lands and were forced to seek their fate in war or in the service of more powerful feudal lords. Some were just ordinary warriors who received maintenance for their service, but did not own land. Their lives were full of dangers, because every battle could be the last. But why, despite all the risks, did so many young men aspire to become knights? And what were the advantages of this title in medieval society, in addition to the opportunity to participate in wars? And how did they maintain their high status when their income depended on the land's yield and the Lord's favor? If you want to know the answer to this question, watch this video to the end. The pursuit of knighthood, despite the obvious risks, was driven by a number of impressive advantages and social prestige. First, it was a path to honor and glory. In a society where military prowess was valued above all else, becoming a knight meant receiving the highest recognition. The knight was not just a soldier, he was a member of an elite military fraternity whose ideal was bravery, nobility, and chivalrous honor. Poby victories in battles and tournaments brought knights not only material benefits, ransoms for prisoners, prizes, but also immortal glory, sung in songs and legends. This fame could open the door to higher positions and the favor of a king or baron. Second, knighthood provided social status and economic stability. Even the humblest knight stood much higher than a peasant or ordinary citizen. Receiving a knightly fief meant owning land, and therefore a source of income and power over the peasants. This provided an economic base for maintaining a knightly lifestyle, which included buying expensive armor, weapons, horses, and maintaining an entourage. Even for the younger siblings who could not inherit the main family possessions, military service opened the way to obtaining their own fee for valuable maintenance. Knights had the right to bear arms, to participate in courts, and their word had more weight in society. In addition, the culture of chivalry was incredibly attractive. Tournaments were not only training sessions, but also grand social events where knights could demonstrate their prowess, win the attention of the ladies, and win valuable prizes. Chivalrous poetry, songs, and legends, such as those about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, formed the ideal that many young people aspired to when they dreamed of adventures and exploits. Knighthood was a sacred ritual, often performed in front of a crowd, which gave it special significance and symbolism. This was the moment when a young man turned into a warrior, swearing allegiance to his Lord and God. Maintaining a high status was a constant task. The knight's income depended on the yield of his land and the efficiency of managing the estate. In the event of crop failure or illness of livestock, their income fell, which could lead to financial difficulties. He was also required to provide his own equipment and upkeep, which was very expensive. The armor, weapons, and warhorse cost a fortune. Therefore, many knights were forced to constantly look for sources of income, to participate in campaigns for loot, take ransom for prisoners, and sometimes even engage in robbery. The Lord's favor was also crucial. The baron could grant the knight additional lands, monetary maintenance, or lucrative positions, which strengthened his position. However, the Lord's displeasure could mean losing everything. Thus, the life of a knight was not only noble, but also a constant struggle for survival, requiring courage, ability to manage the land, and, of course, luck on the battlefield. The church in medieval England was not just a religious institution, it was a colossal force that permeated all spheres of society. The clergy, from powerful archbishops and bishops to simple parish priests and monks, formed a separate and extremely influential class. Their role was to pray for the salvation of souls, perform religious rites, and teach and educate the population. The church was the largest landowner after the king, owning vast territories, monasteries, cathedrals, and churches. This gave it enormous economic influence. Monasteries were not only centers of spiritual life, but also large agricultural enterprises producing grain, wine, beer, wool, and other goods. They were also centers of education and culture, where books were copied, ancient knowledge was preserved, and sciences and arts developed. Monks and nuns devoted their lives to the service of God, work and prayer, as well as charity, helping the poor and sick. Bishops and abbots were often powerful political figures who were members of the royal council and exerted influence on state affairs. They had considerable power and wealth, living in luxurious residences and having their own courtyards. Parish priests, on the other hand, lived much more modestly, serving in villages and towns, holding masses, baptisms, weddings, and funerals. They were closely connected with the daily life of the peasants, acting as spiritual guides, advisors, and even arbitrators in disputes. But why, despite their spiritual mission, did the church wield so much secular power and wealth? And how did it maintain its authority over all segments of society, including the king? And what were the relations between the secular and spiritual authorities? And were they always peaceful? If you want to know the answer to this question, please watch this video to the end. Tridi at the video de cansa. The church maintained its enormous authority over all segments of society, including the king, due to several fundamental factors. First, it was her monopoly on saving the soul. In medieval Christendom, where the belief in the afterlife and the Last Judgment was deeply rooted, only the church held the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Excommunication from the church was the most terrible punishment, which threatened not only with earthly privations, but also with eternal torment. This kept even the most powerful rulers in awe and submission. A king who needed a divine blessing to legitimize his authority could not afford to clash with the Pope or his bishops for too long. Second, the church had a cultural and intellectual monopoly. She was the primary guardian of literacy, education, and knowledge. Monasteries were centers of book copying, Latin studies, theology, philosophy, and even medicine. It was the church that shaped the worldview of medieval man, dictated moral norms, and explained the world. She controlled the calendar, holidays, and rituals, which made her an integral part of everyone's daily life. Priests were the only ones who could read and write in most rural communities, which gave them great influence. Third, the economic power of the church was enormous. As the largest landowner, she received huge incomes from her estates, collected tithes, a mandatory tax of 10% of income, from the entire population, and also received numerous donations and gifts. These riches allowed the church to build magnificent cathedrals, maintain armies of monks, priests, and servants, and provide charitable assistance, which further strengthened its authority among the common people. Thus, it had not only spiritual, but also a very tangible material power. With the development of cities in the Middle Ages, a new dynamic class appeared, the townspeople, or burghers. They differed from the peasants in that they were not tied to the land and did not depend directly on the feudal lord. The townspeople engaged in trade, crafts, and service provision, creating the foundation for the future urban economy. Cities were centers of trade where goods from different regions and countries were collected. Merchants, from small shopkeepers to powerful guilds, played a key role in this system, organizing supplies, sales, and financial transactions. Artisans, blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, shoemakers, bakers, and many others produced all the necessary goods from tools to clothing and food. They formed guilds that regulated production, set quality standards, protected the interests of their members, and trained new craftsmen. The life of the townspeople was freer than that of the peasants. Cities often had self-government, receiving charters from the king that granted them certain freedoms and privileges. This attracted fleeing peasants to the cities, who, after a year and one day of living in the city, could gain freedom from feudal dependence. The townspeople lived in cramped but busy neighborhoods where each house often combined a living space with a workshop or shop. Their lives were full of work, but also opportunities for earning money and social growth. However, despite their relative freedom, the townspeople faced their own problems: overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, fires, epidemics, and the constant threat of feudal lords who sought to subjugate the city's freedoms. How were the townspeople able to achieve such a degree of independence from the feudal system that dominated the countryside? And what were the main sources of their wealth and influence? And why was their appearance a harbinger of profound changes in medieval society? If you want to know the answer to this question, watch this video to the end. The townspeople were able to achieve a significant degree of independence from the feudal system through economic strength and collective organization. The main sources of their wealth and influence were trade and crafts. Cities located at the intersection of trade routes or with access to seaports became centers of exchange of goods between different regions and countries. Merchants organized caravans and fleets, bringing exotic spices, expensive fabrics, mules, wine, and other valuables that were not produced in the countryside. This flow of goods generated huge profits. Artisans, in turn, produced all the necessary products, from everyday utensils to luxury goods, which were in demand among both the urban population and the nobility. To protect their economic interests and achieve independence, the townspeople united in communes, city unions that collectively opposed the arbitrariness of the feudal lords. They were willing to pay the king or major lords large sums of money for charters that granted cities the rights to self-government, their own courts, tax collection, and the creation of militias. Such charters were actually the constitution of the city, protecting its inhabitants from direct interference by feudal lords. Kings who needed money for wars, construction often made such concessions, seeing cities as a source of stable income and loyal allies against the powerful aristocracy. Thus, cities became islands of freedom in the feudal sea, attracting peasants who fled from serfdom. The 1 year and 1 day rule allowed a runaway peasant to gain his freedom if he was able to live in the city undetected by the lord during this period. The emergence of city dwellers and the development of cities was a harbinger of profound changes in medieval society, as it was the germ of a new, capitalist mode of production and relations. Cities undermined the foundations of the feudal system, which was based on land ownership and subsistence farming. The cities were dominated by monetary relations, banks, loans, and trading companies developed. Urban life encouraged the development of education. Schools and universities were established. Innovation in handicrafts and the expansion of people's worldview as they came into contact with merchants from different countries and cultures. At the very bottom of the medieval social pyramid was the peasantry, the vast majority of the population, accounting for up to 90% of all residents of England. Their life was hard, full of hardships and constant work. The peasants did not own the land they worked on. They were attached to a manor, a feudal estate, and rented land from the lord in exchange for labor and dues. There were several categories of peasants. The villeins were the largest group. They were entitled to their allotment of land, but were required to perform corvée, work on the lord's land several days a week, pay dues, part of the harvest or other produce, and perform various other duties such as repairing roads, bridges, or the lord's buildings. They could not leave the manor without the lord's permission, and their children inherited their position. Coterie. The cotters were even poorer, with very small plots of land or none at all, and lived mostly on day labor for other peasants or on the lord's land. The life of a peasant was cyclical, determined by the change of seasons and agricultural work, plowing, sowing, reaping, caring for livestock. Their diet was meager, consisting mainly of bread, cereals, vegetables, and sometimes meat. The houses were simple, often one-room huts made of wood and clay, with dirt floors and thatched roofs. They were subject to famine, disease, and raids. However, despite their dependence, the peasants were the backbone of the entire society, producing food that fed everyone from the king to the knight. Without their work, the entire system would have collapsed. But how did they survive in the conditions of constant exploitation, unpredictable weather, and frequent crop failures? And did they have any opportunities to improve their lives or resist the Lord's tyranny? If you want to know the answer to this question, watch this video to the end. Farmers survived in conditions of constant exploitation and unpredictable weather thanks to several key factors: strong community ties, collective work, and deep knowledge of the land. First, the community was everything to the peasant. Neighbors helped each other in case of illness, crop failure, or other disasters. There were informal arrangements for mutual assistance in plowing, sowing, and reaping, as well as in building or repairing houses. These bonds of interdependence were vital, as it was almost impossible for a single peasant to survive alone. In times of famine, the community could share the last of its supplies or collectively ask for help from a lord or church. Second, the collective system of farming in open field system, provided some stability. The land of the village was divided into large fields, which in turn were divided into strips allocated to peasant families. Decisions on crops and crop rotation were made collectively, which allowed optimizing the use of resources and preventing soil depletion. Communal pastures and forests were accessible to all, allowing them to graze livestock and gather firewood or berries. It was a kind of collective insurance against individual failures. Third, the peasants had a deep practical knowledge of farming, animal husbandry, and survival. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation and included an understanding of weather cycles, pest management, food storage, and the use of local resources. They were able to effectively use navas to fertilize fields, build simple but functional dwellings, and make basic tools and household items. Their life was permeated by the principle of self-sufficiency, where each family sought to provide itself with everything necessary as much as possible, minimizing dependence on foreign markets. Finally, collective resistance was the peasants' most powerful weapon. Although rebellions were rare, they were extremely destructive. For example, Wat Tyler's rebellion in 1381, caused by excessive taxes and the desire for freedom, shocked the whole of England and showed that even the disenfranchised peasantry can pose a serious threat to the existing order. Although uprisings were usually suppressed, they often led to certain concessions from the nobility and improved conditions for the peasantry in the long run, especially after demographic shocks such as the Black Death, which led to a shortage of labor and, as a result, increased the value of peasant labor. These events, despite their tragic nature, became catalysts for the gradual weakening of serfdom and the emergence of more free forms of labor. Although by the late Middle Ages, slavery in its classical sense, as in ancient Rome, had virtually disappeared in England in the early stages of the Middle Ages, especially after the Norman conquest of 1066, there was a category of people whose position was extremely close to slavery. These were serfs, or, as they were sometimes called, bondsmen. Their situation was even worse than that of the villein. Serfs were completely attached to the land and were considered part of the lord's estate. They had no rights, could not own property, could not marry without the lord's permission, and their children automatically inherited their status. Their labor was completely controlled by the lord, and they could be sold along with the land. In fact, they were javum inventarum, the manor's living inventory. Their lives were unbearably hard, and they performed the dirtiest and most labor-intensive jobs without receiving any payment for this, except for a minimum of food and a roof over their heads. However, over time, under the influence of the church and economic changes, the status of serfs gradually improved, and many of them passed into the category of villanes. By the 14th century, especially after the devastating Black Death, which led to an acute shortage of labor, the situation of the peasantry as a whole had improved, and the institution of servitude had virtually disappeared. But why did such a cruel form of dependence exist in Christian society, and what led to its gradual disappearance, when it would seem the feudal lords had every reason to keep the peasants in such a powerless position? If you want to know the answer to this question, please watch this video to the end. The relationship between the monarchy and the church was one of the most complex and dynamic aspects of medieval English society. Although the two institutions were closely intertwined and dependent on each other, there was a constant struggle for supreme power and influence. The king, as a secular ruler, sought to control the appointment of bishops and abbots, as well as church lands and revenues. The church, in turn, defended its independence from secular power, asserting its divine origin and the right to spiritual superiority. This struggle often led to sharp conflicts, the most famous of which was the dispute between King Henry II and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, which ended with Becket's murder. The church had a huge influence on the minds of people, as it was the only source of literacy and lifestyle, and also controlled the moral and ethical norms of society. It could excommunicate the king, which would mean the loss of his divine legitimacy, and could provoke a revolt of the nobility. The kings, in turn, sought to use the church to strengthen their power by appointing bishops loyal to them and using the church's revenues for their own needs. This symbiosis and conflict defined many political events of the Middle Ages. The church was not only a spiritual beacon, but also a powerful political player, whose word carried weight in the highest echelons of power. But why, despite all the conflicts, have the monarchy and the church never been able to completely sever their ties? And why have they continued to need each other, even when their interests diverged? And how did this constant tension affect the lives of ordinary people who were forced to submit to both secular and spiritual authorities? If you want to know the answer to this question, watch this video to the end. In cities where crafts and trade flourished, guilds played a central role in organizing the life of the townspeople. Guilds were professional associations of artisans, for example, Bakers' Guild, Blacksmiths' Guild, Weavers' Guild, or merchants. They were created to protect the interests of their members, regulate production, maintain quality standards, and train new generations of craftsmen. Each guild had its own strict rules and hierarchy. Apprentices were trained by a master for years, then became journeymen, working for a fee, and finally, after creating a masterpiece and passing an exam, they could become masters and open their own workshop. Guilds controlled prices, production volumes, and market access, creating virtual monopolies in their industries. In addition to their economic functions, guilds also played important social roles. They provided their members with social protection, assistance in case of illness, disability or death, support for widows and orphans. They organized religious festivals, processions, and charity events. Guilds were powerful political forces in cities, influencing city governance and protecting their privileges from outside encroachments. But why, despite all the advantages, did guilds often become a source of conflict and discourage innovation? And how did their strict rules affect the development of craft and trade in the Middle Ages? If you want to know the answer to this question, watch this video to the end. The status of women in medieval English society was complex and multifaceted, defined by their social status, marital status, and regional characteristics. In general, the society was patriarchal, and women had limited rights compared to men. Their main role was to manage the household, raise children, and maintain the family hearth. However, this does not mean that women were completely disenfranchised or invisible. In the peasant environment, women played a vital role in agriculture, working alongside men in the fields, tending livestock, harvesting crops, and engaging in domestic production, spinning, weaving, and cooking. Their work was indispensable for the survival of the family. In the cities, women could engage in crafts and trade, often continuing the work of their fathers or husbands. Some women became successful merchants or headed workshops. In the upper strata of society, women from noble families could wield considerable influence through their husbands, sons, or brothers. They managed estates in the absence of men, engaged in diplomacy, and sometimes even led the defense of castles. Nuns in monasteries found opportunities for education, intellectual development, and spiritual service, becoming influential figures in religious life. However, despite these opportunities, most women were denied political rights, were unable to hold public office, and were restricted in their choice of profession. Their lives were dominated by a man, their father, husband, or brother. But why, despite all the limitations, did women play such a fundamental role in medieval society? And how did their invisible work and influence shape the daily life and even politics of the time? And what were the ways for women to move beyond traditional roles and gain recognition in a male-dominated world? If you want to know the answer to this question, watch this video to the end. Medieval English society was multi-layered, complex, and, by our standards, extremely unfair. From the divine king to the disenfranchised peasant, each person held a strictly defined place in the hierarchy, and their life was predetermined from birth. Power, wealth, and privilege were concentrated in the hands of a few, while the vast majority of the population lived in a constant struggle for survival. However, even in this rigid system, people found ways to adapt, fight for their rights, and create a unique culture that still amazes us with its depth and diversity. Understanding this structure helps us better understand how the foundations of the modern world were formed and why the struggle for freedom and equality has been so important throughout history. If you are interested in learning about the secrets of medieval society and want to continue immersing yourself in the wonderful world of history, be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Your support helps us create even more exciting content. See you soon on your new historical journeys.